Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our price formation enhancements phase Tuesday quarter meeting for day two, scarcity pricing. My name is Brenda Marquez on behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group. We welcome you for the second part of our two-day revised our proposal meeting. Today, I'll go over some few housekeeping reminders that this call is being recorded for informational and community purpose only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And this meeting is also stimulated to structured to stimulate dialogue and to engage different perspectives. So we encourage all comments to be respectful and professional manner. We also ask that you introduce yourself, your organization, and we will kind of follow along with James when he's speaking and also pause for questions. You do have closed captioning available on the left of your screen and transparency viewer also available on the right of your screen. So you'll be able to see who's in the call. Our event producer is Chris. He'll be assisting us with any technical issues, but if you do have questions, feel free to send it to all panelists. To ask a question, we do ask that you raise your hand located in the middle of the toolbar. You'll be added to the question queue. Once you're unmuted, wait about 2 seconds, and then you just state your full name and affiliation. If you're just dialing in through the phone line, you will utilize *3 to be added to the question queue, and then we'll be calling on you based on the last 4 digits of your phone number. As a reminder, the California ISO stakeholder process posted a diagram a few months ago, kind of overviewing of our steps. Right now, we currently are in the developing phase. We did provide a revised straw proposal on July 2nd for topic 1 and 2. We are going to kind of cover a little bit on the feedback and also the timeline of where we're going and the next steps as well, for the comments are being due on July 28th for both topic 1 and topic 2, day 1 and 2. For today's agenda, we will be having an opening recap again, similar to yesterday's, but this one we guided towards scarcity pricing scope. And then we will have James and Danny Johnson kind of cover a little bit on the load shedding pricing, explain triggers on SMM RTD scope, safeguards, and circuit breaker. About 1 hour in, we will shift over to RM resource pricing and explaining the RTPD, RTD issue, RM load and reserves as an example. And then 2 hours in, we will go with deferred issues. The purpose of the deferred issues will consist of administrative emergency actions and comprehensive scarcity pricing. And then at closing time, we'll kind of have more feedback and summarize the next steps, similar as yesterday's agenda and timing. I definitely want to introduce Danny Johnson, the manager of policy development team, and June, who's been leading on price formation. He will be kind of covering most of it and supporting from the ISO staff as well. So thank you all for joining. We can go ahead and do a quick audio check with James.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Brenda, and welcome back. For those that joined us yesterday, this is the day 2 of our 2-day discussion on price formation enhancements. Today, we'll be talking about scarcity pricing and the 2 proposals that are inside of the revised straw proposal under the umbrella of scarcity pricing. Let's go to the next slide, please. So these set of slides are going to be essentially the same as the ones yesterday. If you were here for yesterday's call, these will be familiar to you, but just to set the stage for our discussion today, we have the following goals in our discussion. First, we want to explain the revisions that were made in the revised straw proposal relative to the straw proposal that was published last August. Section 1 of the revised straw proposal focuses specifically on the changes that were made and why. And so we want to make sure that stakeholders and market participants are aware of the changes that were made to these proposals. We're going to walk through the mechanics of each of the proposals today. I believe both have corresponding examples that we'll talk about today and also in the straw proposal itself. And so, well, on this slide, it says, I think we forgot to update the middle box of this slide, but we're not going to be talking about these market power mitigation concepts. We'll be talking about the scarcity pricing concepts. So we'll be talking about walking through the mechanics of the armed reserve pricing and also of the load shed pricing as well. And this is obviously an opportunity for stakeholders to provide feedback to the ISO and to provide feedback and context for each other in preparation for submission of formal comments that will be, I believe, due on July 28th. And Brenda will talk more about that when we close this meeting. I'll make sure before each sort of group of slides to let you know how many slides I'm going to go through before we'll pause for questions, because we'll try to keep, all the slides within a certain technical block together so that we can make sure I can present the entire set of information before we get into questions. And then, of course, we are going to do our best to separate the current items that are in discussion for the revised draft proposal that we're proposing and hoping to take to the October 2026 governing body meeting for governance decision from future items that we plan to discuss in the PFE working group series with you all after that decision is done. Let's go to the next slide. So again, a 2-day roadmap. Yesterday we met on BA level market power mitigation. If you missed that meeting, the recording will be posted on our website within a couple of days. And today we're here for scarcity pricing. We'll be talking about the difference in the proposals in which we feel, based on the stakeholder record, that certain proposals are ready to advance. We'll be talking about specific areas of feedback that we're hoping to get from stakeholders as we move towards a draft final proposal in the coming months, and then talk a little bit about the future phase of this initiative and hear feedback on priorities and topics that the CAISO should be thinking about for future phases of this initiative. Next slide, please. These set of boxes summarize essentially the executive summary of the proposal. Really, the goals of this proposal are sort of twofold at this point. One is to reduce over-mitigation in this context being unnecessary market power mitigation by accounting for the competition provided by neighboring BAAs in the EDAM and WIM, by accounting for affiliates' native load serving obligations when determining how much capacity they could withhold from the market, and also potentially limiting the application of mitigation to only truly pivotal suppliers instead of all of the suppliers in a failed group. Today we'll be talking more about the second items, which are fundamentally about preserving price signals in the real-time market. So they're, both of these proposals that we're discussing today arise out of concerns that there may be market mechanisms or other reasons to believe that prices can be suppressed, legitimate prices can be suppressed when supply is tight and the market needs resources. And so, that's exactly what the two proposals we'll talk about today are designed to do under very specific conditions. And then finally, the proposal also defers some unresolved issues, including yesterday we talked about the revised straw proposal, defers the issue of the CAISO BAA's participation within the grouping approach, but also, as we've talked about over the last several months in this initiative, deferral of a more comprehensive scarcity pricing redesign at the current time. And the idea being that once this current set of changes that we feel, have sufficient, stakeholder support and design behind them, can go through governance changes this year, that we would go ahead and resume discussions on these deferred items for further development and design work, possibly starting by the end of the year. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, we just want to reflect and thank stakeholders and participants for many different opportunities to provide feedback that informed this revised proposal. More detail about the specific stakeholder process and timeline can be found in section 3 of the proposal, including summaries and discussions from each of these specific touch points, but we'll just walk through them very briefly here. After the in August 2025, we posted the straw proposal and we held a series of stakeholder meetings to discuss that straw proposal, and also received formal comment from many different entities, which we very much appreciate. And those discussions led very much to some direct changes to this revised proposal around the market power mitigation and scarcity pricing elements. In October of 2025, the CAISO, in combination with VTOL, held a spotlight presentation to the WEM governing body on scarcity pricing, and CAISO at that meeting introduced its plan to separate scarcity pricing on 2 different tracks, one being a near-term package that we'll be discussing today, and a longer-term package on a more comprehensive scarcity pricing design work. Also in November 2025, the CAISO held 2 stakeholder working group meetings specifically on starting discussions for the longer term issues on scarcity pricing, and with the intention to start on some of the early design work of those proposals. But later, based on stakeholder feedback, decided that it was premature to have these discussions and go ahead and focus on some of these more narrow items that we'll talk about today, and defer those issues for a later time. In January 2026, we held an MSC discussion on price formation, which CAISO presented to the Market Surveillance Committee some updated analysis on BA level market power, including some of the changes that were proposed today, or proposed yesterday, well, discussed yesterday, but proposed in the revised proposal, around modifications to the grouping approach, and incorporation of the load serving obligations for affiliates and how that impacted the market power mitigation analysis. And CAISO also received feedback from MSC members, both theoretical and practical, on the mitigation and scarcity pricing, and things that the CAISO should be thinking about in terms of its design and analysis moving forward. Finally, in March 2026, there was a second spotlight presentation given to the governing body. In this time, CAISO, not much of an active participant, but it was a panel of stakeholders that included Calpine and 6 cities as a representative of a joint group of load serving entities in California, Public Generating Pool, and Portland General Electric, who presented to the governing body their views on the timing, and a little bit on the scope of scarcity pricing, and essentially to let the governing body hear directly from stakeholders the differing views on when to do comprehensive scarcity pricing. So that was really valuable. I also just like to mention, I'm not sure the exact timing of the governing body meeting this week, but it's my understanding that market expert Susan Pope will have a presentation to the governing body on her views on comprehensive scarcity pricing. So those that are interested in that discussion should definitely tune in to her presentation to the governing body, and/or check out her material on the governing body's website. So we just want to summarize again and say thank you for all the feedback that we've received. Stakeholder feedback for sure it's directly changed the scope and sequencing and design of this proposal, and we hope we did a good job of capturing that in section 1 of the proposal. Okay, so we have, that's the end of this sort of series of framing slides. We have a few minutes if there's any, sort of clarifying questions or feedback at this stage. We will have more, obviously some slides more detailed on the actual proposals for scarcity pricing today. But we'll take a quick pause to see if there's any questions or feedback at this point.
I don't see any questions in the queue, James.
Okay, let's move on then. So we're going to break up this conversation into two parts. We're going to first talk about the load shed pricing, and then we'll talk about the armed reserve pricing, uh, and we'll have some time set aside to talk about the deferred issues related to scarcity pricing, and then we'll close the meeting. So I believe that this set of slides is going to, I think I'm going to have 5 slides on the load shed pricing, and then we'll pause for discussion and questions. So let's go to the next slide, please. This is a slide mostly to introduce and well, remind you of the problem statement that the working group has come up with on scarcity pricing. Essentially that fundamentally reserves become more valuable as they get more scarce because they reduce curtailment risk. And so all else equal, generally the more reserves that a system operator has access to, the more reliable the grid is at any given time because they have a larger buffer to be able to handle unexpected events, contingencies, changes in load or forecasting and things like that. Right now in the market design, the problem statement is that real-time prices may not rise steadily before emergencies or in ways that reflect the reliability value of reserves at those times. And we've talked about that at length over the series of this working group. And while it is a sort of a long-term priority for the ISO to improve its scarcity pricing in a broader sense, this proposal focuses more on near-term issues about improving prices during discrete times. The one being when operators are shedding firm load, and the second being when operators have armed load to substitute for contingency reserves, and that releases reserves into the market that can be redispatched for energy. And so those are the two opportunities that we see as some near-term improvements on pricing during tight system conditions that can provide some incremental benefit as we work our way towards a longer-term design. So again, as I mentioned, the revised draft proposal does not consider or propose a comprehensive scarcity pricing redesign. It is something that the ISO wants to accomplish, and the plans to reignite those discussions after the governance changes for these, or governance decision for these items are undertaken. Let's go to the next slide. So we have a few different places here where some specific stakeholder feedback helped shape the proposals in the revised draft proposal. Again, this is a summary of the information from section 1 of the revised draft proposal that gets into this stuff in more detail, but these are just a few that I thought I would highlight for you all. There was some feedback from stakeholders from the last proposal in which the load shed pricing changes originally were only intended to apply to RTD. RTD is the CAISO's 5-minute market. And the stakeholders felt like it was important for that proposal to extend also into the FMM, with the primary reason being that intertie transactions are settled based on FMM prices. And so if part of the intention for having these pricing rules during load shed is to encourage as much supply as possible, including incremental supply over the interties, that it would be important to include the actual market with which these intertie transactions are being settled. Also, stakeholders had seemed to favor an in-market approach to this load shed pricing. The straw proposal actually considered three different options, one being an in-market approach, and two being sort of post-market settlement, sort of settlement-only changes that would happen. And so the revised straw proposal moves forward with an in-market approach rather than one of these post-hoc settlement-only rules. And we'll talk a little bit more in these slides about some of the implementation options that we might have to go ahead and do that, and look forward to some feedback there. I already mentioned number two, that the RTD design would miss FMM settled imports and transfers referring to FMM transfers in the WEIM. So the revised straw proposal does extend the load shed pricing mechanism to both the RTD and the FMM. But there were also some feedback relating to both operational safeguards that may be potentially be needed, and also credit and financial safeguards that may be needed. And so the CAISO, or in the revised straw proposal, we provide a little more detail about both. And so the revised straw proposal does propose to allow operators, if needed, to pause the mechanism if there is observed issues with the mechanism in terms of reliability or ACE management or things of that nature. And the load shed pricing proposal also includes what we'll call a financial circuit breaker, which we'll talk about more in these slides, but essentially is intended to deactivate the mechanism after some extended period of time of load shedding, where that the idea being trying to balance the response from supply during a load shed condition where the price signal is hopefully encouraging suppliers to continue to provide as much as they can, while at the same time managing credit risk and financial exposure for market participants, in case of a very prolonged load shedding event with prices very high. We'll talk more about that. For the armed reserve pricing, there were a lot of calls from stakeholders to clarify some of the terminology and add some examples. And so we did that. The proposal distinguishes better some of the terms that we used in the straw proposal, like what the difference between armed load and armed reserves are, and the way that we use it, or in the way that we use those terms, and also adds a numerical example to demonstrate what the armed reserve pricing would look like, and provides a little bit more detail about how the procedure of arming load shows up in the market, both in RTD and FMM. So we provided a lot more background information on those things that hopefully can make that proposal more clear. We, again, over a series of stakeholder meetings, the comprehensive scarcity pricing remains disputed in its timing and potentially of its scope. And so the revised straw proposal continues to defer that redesign to a future effort. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these set of three slides will be specific on the load shedding pricing proposal. The primary problem statement being that in times of load shed, when we're relying on the market to produce prices and dispatch, the market's view of what demand there is at any given time reflects only the load that remains connected to the grid at any given time. And so, these boxes sort of provide you a sequential look at, first there's sort of emergency or a grid emergency happening where a BA operator is declaring an EEA emergency level 3 and ordering firm load shedding. After that firm load shedding is disconnected from the system, the observed metered load will drop because that disconnected load is not on the system anymore. And then KISO for KISO's markets in the real-time market use what we call a persistence forecast, which is essentially using features of current consumption information, current metered information, to feed back into the forecast model, instead of just sort of a standard weather-based forecast. And so the drop in load gets picked up by the persistence forecast over time, and that becomes part of the input that's going into the market in terms of how much demand to solve for. And that can, by reducing the amount of demand the market is solving for, also can weaken the price signal at these times. And because the market's sort of not considering the disconnected load, which is sort of latent demand on the system, but not actually connected to the system. And so therefore prices may fall, and you may potentially have an outcome where you have lower prices caused by the disconnected load than you'd like to see at that point. And so the primary principle that we're trying to apply is that the real-time market should not treat emergency curtailment as lower demand when solving for the market's prices. Let's go to the next slide. So a little bit more about this. The actual proposal, what would happen is that when it would be the mechanism that we propose in the revised draft proposal would be triggered when a BAA is both in EEA level 3 and the BA operator has an active firm load shed instruction. So this is important that we have both of these things in mind, because there can be local reliability events in which there might be sort of local and discrete load shed instructions going on to manage local issues. And that's not the type of thing that we're talking about here. We're talking about system scarcity, EEA level 3, the protection of reserves, things of that nature, in which firm load shed becomes an issue of insufficient supply to meet the demand on the system. Again, as I explained, the mechanism that we proposed would apply in RTD and FMM to preserve the price signals in both markets, with the basic logic being that if the supply cannot meet the adjusted demand, meaning that the market is going to solve for not just the demand that remains connected to the system, but all the latent demand that was disconnected from the system also. The idea being that if the market is solving for that quantity of demand, then we should either be close to or hitting the power balance constraint in the market. And when that binds, we'll send the appropriate price signals to the market. So again, we talked about FMM. The FMM matters for WIM transfers in FMM, and also KISO intertie resources that can respond to scarcity. And so that being the primary reason why we propose to extend this to the FMM. We acknowledge in the proposal that there are some interesting timing issues related to this, which was part of our hesitation originally to keep this in the RTD. Basically that because FMM binding interval is solving, 37.5 minutes in advance of the actual operating time, that there's not going to be certainty that 37.5 minutes from now, that load shedding conditions will still be ongoing. With RTD solving a lot closer to the operational time, you have near certainty when you're solving RTD, whether there's going to be load shedding in those intervals or not. And so, our primary hesitation was that fact that there may be FMM intervals that are solved as if there were load shedding happening, that when it comes down to the actual operating time, the load shedding had stopped in the time since. And we have some explanation about that in the proposal, which would be section 4.2.1. But we do think that we are convinced by commenters at this point that having the price signal and FMM will matter more than any potential downside to the timing issues observed there. This mechanism we would propose to extend to all WEIM BAs, not just the KISO BA, because this is an emergency event that's fairly standardized in terms of its application. Maybe not exactly how BAs go about the firm load shedding itself, but the EEA level 3 and the discrete timing of when those things happen are consistent across all BAs. And so it could be something, or would be something that we would propose to extend to the entire WEIM. And that's important because if there's any WEIM BA that's in a load shedding condition, you can get the scarcity pricing that you need to direct as much WEIM transfers and other things into that shedding BA as possible to either reduce the severity of the load shedding or reduce the time, how long the load shedding needs to persist. And so that gives the market every option possible to try to direct supply in that direction. And as of that, scarcity prices can reach neighboring BAs insofar as the BAs, if your neighboring BAA is in a load shedding condition and you have uncongested transfer paths between you, the prices that this mechanism applies to that BA can spread through the WEIM insofar as there's open transfer capacity. And that's intentional because that price signal is then what directs as much supply as possible from your neighbors into the shedding BA. And the suppliers that are called upon to respond to that scarcity in the neighboring BA get paid the LMP, the high LMP, for responding to that signal. Next slide, please. Okay, I have two, let's see. How many more slides do I have? I have 3 more slides and then I'll pause for questions and feedback. So we have the proposal lists 2 options under review for implementation. At this time, the ISO hasn't decided which is the better way to implement this. One option is that we can try to either verify or estimate the quantity of load shed happening after a load shedding event occurs and sort of add that as a fixed number to the existing forecast. The second option being that you, instead of using a persistence forecast to solve the FMM and RTD during the load shedding intervals, we could switch to a standard weather-based forecast that would not be impacted by the persistence and the feedback loop of lower metered load, then reducing the persistence forecast. They both have their pros and cons. I think that the KISO probably leans a little bit towards the first one, but the idea, it can be tricky. Operationally, getting the confirmed and verified amount of load shed and its timing with RTD, given all the things that are going on in the control room when a load shedding event happenings, we just don't want to be putting more. If there's a way to standardize this and automate this, that would be probably a preferable option, but we don't want to put a bunch of manual work in the control rooms and distracting from their jobs of keeping these situations under control. And so that's kind of our primary trade-off here with doing number one is what we can accomplish there. And we just have more work to do internally to figure out what those processes might look like. So that's why the second option is there as a way to just say, okay, well, if we don't feel comfortable with standardizing and automating a verified way to add the load shedding quantity back into the market's demand, then we could at least switch the forecast to the standard weather-based forecast at those times, which won't be impacted by the the drop in meter load. So the CAISO does run a standard weather-based forecast alongside the persistence forecast at all times. So it would really just be a matter of logically switching from one forecast to the other. But again, there's more work to be done there. And so, some things that we're thinking about internally about, again, what option is working better during an emergency practically, and also in terms of accuracy, which method can best represent the unserved firm load without overstating the shortfall. So we want the number to be as accurate as possible, because the more accurate the number is, um, prevents any other issues that may happen, that we'll talk a little bit about. Let's go to the next slide. So again, this is just a quick slide on the FMM and RTD timing trade-off that I mentioned already. The FMM run is solving a future interval about 37.5 minutes ahead, and the ISO will not know whether, well, almost certainly may not know whether load shedding will be active then. And so the risk being that, if the load shedding instruction changes in the time between when the FMM binding interval solves and the actual operating time, that you may have prices that are binding settlement prices for FMM that no longer reflect the load shedding condition. And again, we're convinced that at this time that the trade-off is more appropriately leaning towards applying it into the FMM at this time. Let's go to the next slide, and this, I think, will be the last slide for this block. So a couple of things to keep in mind in terms of safeguarding this idea. First, that we're proposing operator authority to suspend or reduce the mechanism if needed. If it looks like this mechanism is providing impacting reliability in a negative way, or operators need to manage or avoid infeasible dispatch. The operators have tools to do that. We have some discussion in the proposal around this issue about ACE and also real-time energy imbalance offset, primarily because when this mechanism would apply, essentially the amount of load or the amount of supply that's being dispatched at any given time, should exceed the actual metered load in the shedding footprint. And so, if that becomes an issue in terms of managing, control error or frequency, or, also driving settlement outcomes where now the metered load and the scheduled load from RTD are not matching, which may drive some real-time energy imbalance offset. These are things that need to be monitored for, to make sure that that's not causing any issues. And so, that those are things that we're looking at and proposing to monitor. Also, insofar as the method of applying the load shed pricing, let's say switching from a persistence forecast to weather-based forecast, insofar as that leads to very different megawatt values to solve the RTD market, that's another thing that we're going to be assessing. And then finally, we have proposed a circuit breaker mechanism. So this is something that was in the straw proposal and continues to be in the revised straw proposal, with the idea that we would automatically turn off this mechanism for a BA after 4 cumulative hours of load shedding conditions in a rolling 24-hour period. The idea being that we want to find a balance between sustaining a scarcity pricing signal. So insofar as the scarcity pricing signal is effective in directing as much supply as possible to that shedding BA, that's a good thing. but then we also don't want to create this sort of open-ended credit and settlement exposure to prolonged outages. And so, fingers crossed, the ISO control area and the WAM hasn't seen a load shedding condition of this nature before, but you know, they've happened across the country. There have been a lot of discussions about whether something like this is necessary. In some places, like ERCOT, they've implemented financial circuit breaker type policies. In other places, like PJM, uh, you know, PJM's scarcity pricing in early 2020s didn't go forward, and so the PJM ended up not implementing their circuit breaker mechanism that they had proposed. And so these are in response to some severe storms and issues that had gone on in those regions. There have been a lot of discussion about this circuit breaker idea, and we think it's something that stakeholders seem to agree was supportable in the straw proposal, and so we continue to have it here. Okay, so that's a lot of information, and I'm happy to take questions and feedback. I have about, let's see, yeah, about 36 minutes available till I have to move on to the next set of slides, so plenty of time for questions and discussion. Any callers in the queue?
I think I'm off mute. James, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. This is Kathleen Colbert from Distress. Thank you very
Hi.
much for your presentation so far. Doing a wonderful job. Um, no, I really appreciate this. I wanted to, I'll be brief, but I wanted to start with an admission that I went and looked back at our comments from the straw proposal, and I wanted to kind of share with you and others, and also see if this resonates with other stakeholders, to feel free to share the similar feedback. I could tell that we were very focused on EDAM and DAME at the time, and I think the content of our comments were more focused on how what you had presented, what the team had presented, would impact that project. And now that we've gone through go live, I do feel like we're able to turn our attention back to like the actual brass tacks of the technical elements of what you are presenting. So I really appreciate you going through it like this. We will provide, I think, probably more useful comments this time around. And yeah, just did want to kind of share that. I think I looked back and it was very little feedback on your proposals, and very much so how EDAM DAME price formation changes needed to be considered. So we're trying to bring our attention back to the table. So with that in mind, I did like, here's my kind of brief feedback, and I will put this exact in writing so that you can use it more going forward. But we, during I think the working group phases, probably provided more feedback. Our attention got pulled to EDAM and DAME after that. But like during that process, what I had been trying to articulate is that an approach like this might work, but our primary concerns, yes, they're about load shed not getting captured by the market forecast. And so the demand looks lower arbitrarily compared to supply available. But our concerns actually start sooner than that. And I think it'll be more helpful when I put in comments. I'll direct you to the exact step within 4420 operating procedure that we had hoped this would, like, something would start to address that concern. We actually see the price formation degrade when, and it's in that 4420, it's section 3.3, it's the utility step, where the DR event board representatives notify and then deploy the DR programs, which are outside of the market, right? When that step occurs, that's when we see the price start to crater within on ISO today. So I'll put that in comments. I think that will help make it more practical what we're asking you to consider. And it truly is, because that's when the prices start to not be representative of supply and demand fundamentals. The other piece of feedback is that window, again, that's like very much so our focus because that's the operational concern we've seen. That window is hour ending 17 through hour ending 21. That's a 5-hour window. So while I broadly have concern with like the breadth of the operator kind of so control you're presenting, I very practically would like you to reconsider the 4 hours to align it better with what's in operating procedure 4420 as a very narrow kind of refinement and improvement. I think that will make it more rational to the real world. And that's it. Yeah. Thank
Oh,
you so much.
okay. Just on that last one,
Yeah.
definitely go back and I'll definitely go back and read 4420. You mentioned something about a 5-hour period. Are
Mm-hmm.
you suggesting that the circuit breaker should align with
Yes.
a 5-hour period or some other length of period that's relevant to 4420? Just to make
That's
sure I heard
correct.
that right.
That is what
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
suggesting. Yeah. Trying to take with the caveat that we're still a little uneasy with what you're laying out on this slide. Um, if it's not it what I'm uneasy about is whether or not we'll be able to understand the decisions being made during these conditions, right? So that's like but put that to side. So assume you do adopt some kind of process like you show here. My very narrow
Mhm.
feedback is on the circuit breaker. It should align to a rational operating procedure concept. And so we do have the DR event board is looking at hours ending 17 through 21 and
Mhm.
identifying, and maybe there is a different kind of refinement. But yes, I very much so would like to see the KISO align whatever circuit breaker concept it adopts to make sure that it doesn't interfere with getting what you need during the reliability event.
Great. That's good feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Okay, testing my audio. Okay, so next
You're
we do
good.
have Alva. Thank you. Go ahead, Alva. So everyone, just so you know, we still have about 30 minutes. Um, so it should be about 4 to 5 minutes per person. We do have a list. Go ahead, Alva.
Great. Can you hear me? That counts for 2 seconds, right?
Yes.
This is Alva from PG, Alva Svoboda from PG&E. I I don't know if we need to refer to the slide where you discussed the two options, but I had questions there, and I don't necessarily expect you to answer them now because this is really kind of in a half-baked state at this point. But one is, seems to me like you should be looking at a different approach than either the verified load shedding or the weather-based forecast, because both of those are subject to actual errors introduced by telemetry that could be really significant, but rather developing some form of estimation of what you need to include in the market. You know, you can call this, we don't really know what the load shedding is, right? So it's an estimated quantity that keeps the process working stably. You can call it estimated load shed, but it seems to me like once you've assumed that something has been taken out, you don't want to then just leave yourself open to some completely different quantity coming into the dispatch and causing unforeseen results. So that's one comment I have, and I don't expect you to necessarily have unless you have an immediate response to why that's not a good idea. I just wanted to sort of related to that, another area which you've I think alluded to, which I think is a real difficulty here, is with how do these um, uh, interact with essentially the end of an EEA event. So what sort of hangover is there in this process? Because obviously, like you said, the 50-minute market is going to have done certain things. The event ends, and what happens at that point in the real-time market, and what happens in future iterations? Do you just is there a step drop that can cause problems there? And
Mhm.
then the third sort of related, also another step issue that I think would need to be confronted here is what happens when there is some other form of large step change in the market solution, especially if you're able to, um, do unit commitment, because this thing lasts for a couple of hours. And then unit commitment can obviously put load in that you don't want to be then, you want to somehow be accounting for in this balance that's different from just sort of dispatching up to meet that that load. And related to that, I was wondering whether you want to discuss. I mean, this seems like a really good approach in my mind. I think this is great for the kinds of load interruptions that we've seen. But if it were a larger quantity, this approach seems to me could do really poorly. And you'd want to have some more essentially framework for dealing with if the amount of load interruption were larger, and essentially you're really distorting the market solution. So those are my thoughts. Just interested in what your response is on those.
Yeah, I marked down four different elements here, and I think I agree with all of them. So let's try to keep me honest and remembering all four of them. But first, on the implementation options, I think we agree on the goal here, which is to try to implement a method that can, as accurately as possible, represent the amount of shed load, which, as you point out, is not easy to do. And we can provide more. We plan to provide more information on, deeper dives with CAISO ops and other subject matter experts about how that works. And but we're aligned on sort of the overall goal is we're trying to make it as accurate as possible, and that kind of connects to number 4, which is discussion about the larger disruptions. I also agree. I think that that this mechanism in mind could be appropriate for the types of very limited, thankfully very limited load shedding, both quantities and duration that we've observed historically in the control area. But for larger disruptions, both in terms of time and quantity, I agree. I think that's why we're trying to think about both the circuit breaker mechanism, which would decouple sort of the financial risk involved, but also operationally, if for some reason like you need to shed half the load in a control area, then that obviously is not what this is intended
Right,
to
right.
represent very well. And so there would be some sort of operational discretion about
Yeah, that
whether
makes
or
sense.
not whether or not. And so I think more precise guidelines around when this is useful and when it's not, depending on the issue, I think sounds like something you're suggesting would be useful for us to think about for the next round.
Yeah.
And then,
Can I
yeah.
counter you on that very first point? I'm not sure that the trying to get exactly what would have happened is the issue. You're trying to get it at as close as possible to the right prices
Right.
to and so that's not necessarily going to be captured by doing exactly the right load, the right amount of load shedding. I'm not saying it isn't. I just want to express some skepticism about the objective isn't to try to create an exact counterfactual, especially because of the FMM and RTD interactions. It's to try to get a level of imputed load into the market system that gives you the right price signal based on where things are going.
Right. Yeah,
So I
that's a
think it's
better,
a different
actually, yeah, I agree.
problem.
I,
Yeah,
no, I agree. That's a better way of putting it. And then I'll have to, with that comment, reflect on the options presented in the original straw proposal, because the end market option holds you hostage to the market solution in terms of its prices.
right.
And if your goal is to say, because there was an option within the ones presented in the straw proposal that basically said, on a post hoc basis, you just overwrite the prices to, we'll say the bid cap or something
Mm-hmm,
like that.
mm-hmm.
Then you do have achieved the goal of having what you might think of as more appropriate prices during that period, but you will lose
The
um,
incentive effect.
the opportunity for the market to direct dispatches and commitments in ways that might, you
Right.
know, uh, and we reflect on. Let me find this. In section 1, it's probably buried in there, but we do reflect a little bit on the fact that we don't hold the view that a post hoc solution is completely incompatible, because there will be indirect effects on bidding behavior and other things where market participant knows a certain price mechanism will occur at a discrete point of time, can change market participant behavior in ways that could elicit some positive feedback loops. But it's not going to be as direct and as fluid as doing it directly in the market as we've proposed in this design.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm not. I don't like the post hoc approach. I think the moving forward, though, you want to look at the CAISO as being essentially you've inserted CAISO as a market participant by taking this step. And so the question is, what's the right stand for the CAISO to take as a market participant? And maybe you're saying the most conservative approach is you just try to get the best data you can from the system and then you run accordingly. But given how unpredictable that is, I think you might want to look at it more as if I as the CAISO want to create imputed load that will lead to the right signals being sent to the market for this limited period that I have this power. And so I think I still think that you want to look at it as more of a CAISO decision variable rather than we have to use some numbers that are coming from essentially a telemetry process, because I don't trust telemetry as the guide to the right decision to be happening under these kinds of emergencies.
Yeah, those are fair comments. I'll touch on one more of your points, which is the timing issue, and I think that the next proposal can do a better job of setting up some example about, if let's say we had a load shedding event that starts and stops within some time interval, and then we can overlay the RTPD and RTD intervals on top of that to make some decisions and clear explanation about when this would be in effect and not, I think is a good idea.
That'd be right. Thank you, James. This is really great. I really like Kathleen. I appreciate the clarity with which you're presenting this time.
Thank you very much.
Next, we do have Dawn. You will be unmuted. Go ahead and introduce your first name and your organization.
Good afternoon, Don Trethewey, California Energy Storage Alliance. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hey, Don.
Hey, so I think this is actually a great slide because I think it actually clearly highlights the issues with trying to implement scarcity pricing by manipulating the load forecast. And I think really what we're looking at is we're in the period here in terms of the energy supply margin or the latent reserves where we're out. In essence, you're at sort of the final step in which you would want to relax that requirement. And so it's the highest cost you would relax that requirement. And so I think the better way to think about this to maintain the price is not to adjust the load, because I'm fully confident that if I was an operator and I had the option to disable it, I would disable it immediately, because I'd be more concerned about creating infeasible dispatches to add to the other issues I'm dealing with. And if you actually had a requirement in that you could adjust and have it a certain price, and you relax that requirement, and that's what maintains your price at if that's the objective. You want to try to as Alva said, you just want to try to maintain the price. And I think it's more appropriate to do it through, a demand curve based on the energy supply margin or the latent reserves, that you relax that at a value, and it's relaxing that keeps the price where you want it. And you could adjust the requirements based upon your estimate of how much load, increase the requirement or but I think that this is the whole reason why there's the issue, why the comprehensive scarcity pricing design is actually needed. We need to move away from trying to do these things by changing the load or biasing or all of that. We need to actually relax some requirement at a value, and we can all disagree on what the right value is, what the level of lost load is, all of that. But I think we should all agree on the implementation standpoint. What's listed here are significant reasons why we would not want to implement what's being proposed. And there's no way to sort of tweak the design to address any of these. The only way to do that is to relax something else besides the load forecast, which would be, the energy supply margin requirement or latent reserve, whatever term we want to use for it. But you need to have a requirement in the market that can be relaxed at a price and use that to maintain the prices, or at a cost, and use that to maintain the energy prices in these events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. I'll summarize, put it another way for the audience, essentially that maybe the proposal for this in 4.2.1 becomes irrelevant or useless in after such time where we have a comprehensive scarcity pricing design. And so it's worth thinking about if this becomes something that's overwritten, or we design in the future a much better way of accomplishing the same thing, if it's worth pursuing this at this time as sort of a standalone proposal. So I think that's very
Well,
fair feedback. Yeah.
Well, I think the key here is what you're designing is the price you want to keep. You want to keep the price when you're in scarcity. So in
Mm-hmm.
essence, you're not. The advocates of comprehensive scarcity pricing. We've been advocating that we want to see prices gradually rise before we get to the actual event. Well, we're in the event here, and I think my point
Mm-hmm.
is it's relaxing a requirement that addresses the concerns that are raised here in terms of the need for operator authority and settlement monitoring. It's again, that's the approach that we should be trying to take so that we don't create these problems at the most problematic periods on the grid. And then I
Mm-hmm.
would note, we're not opposed to a circuit breaker. Again, it's just making it appropriate to, as Kathleen pointed out, is 4 hours right days or 5 hours. At some
Mm-hmm.
point you're right, it doesn't make sense. But I do think trying to do this through the load forecast is problematic. It'd be far better to do it through an actual requirement that's relaxed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Don. That's good feedback. We still have about 15 minutes for this section.
Okay. Next we have Patrick. Patrick, if you can stick within like 3 minutes, that'll be great. You'll be unmuted.
Hi, Patrick Cunningham at the Public Advocate's Office. Just a quick technical question. When the scarcity pricing mechanism ends when we exit load shedding, but when exactly do we exit load shed? Is that when the market operator calls for it to cease load shed, or is it when the very last transmission operator reports that load shed operations are complete, or I'm just not sure when that occurs.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the proposal does not define that, and it should be defined. So I don't have an answer for you, but I can tell you that it's a question that needs to be answered to implement this.
Okay, we'll put it in our comments once again. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Next we have Bonnie Blair. Bonnie Blair, you will be unmuted, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. James, you mentioned that this mechanism wouldn't apply in situations where load shedding was directed to address a local problem, and that makes sense to me. I guess I have a question about whether there could be overlap, and in other words, where a local problem could require load shedding at the same time that the system is experiencing an overall challenge. And one possible scenario that popped into my head was load shedding to mitigate fire danger at the same time when system demand overall is very high. Is that a nuance that you should try to think about the potential for and create an adjustment mechanism? In other words, a way to distinguish between the load that's being shed to address a local problem or a safety issue versus versus load that's being shed to address an overall insufficiency?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm gonna think of it in two ways because I think that the proposal posits that insofar as the EEA 3 condition is there, that the mechanism would be present, even if there were overlapping issues going on in terms of local reliability need. And so I think that's what I think that's what the intention of the proposal would be. But then the thing that your question is interesting insofar as that you can be, let's say you can be in EEA 3 conditions. Uh, Remember that EEA 3 does not necessarily mean load shedding conditions. That's an extra step. And there could possibly be in EEA 3 conditions where you have some, as you say, like say fire issues, where you have local reliability issues that are almost hard to distinguish between, what is a local and what is a system problem at that point. And so I think that needs some much more discussion with our operators in terms of, do they feel, is there a clear demarcation of how we can distinguish between those two things when the line might be a little blurry at times. And so I think that's a very fair observation, something we need to think more about.
Yeah, I have no idea how likely that confluence of events is, and whether it's something that would occur. But it seems to me, if you're shedding load in area X because of high winds and concerns about fire danger, that price isn't going to impact that one way or the other. And nor should that, I think, impact the system price. And yeah, so I think thinking about that possibility and that distinction, and trying to,
Yeah.
build in a response to it.
Well, there's an element here of you just got me thinking that in those cases, let's say for some sort of a fire shut off or something like that, you actually don't want the market to be sending supply in that direction because you're curtailing the load as a safety issue. And so, yeah, you're really trying to isolate, times of general system scarcity leading to sort of broad controlled load shedding events. And how can we distinguish appropriately between those things?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
We still have
Next we
about
have
9 minutes.
Stephen. Okay. Yeah, Stephen, and then Alan, and then that's it. Go ahead, Stephen from Edison.
Yeah, hi, Steve Keen from Edison. I'm going to follow up to make a point with Bonnie. One of the things that got me thinking about is as we now have a market that's west-wide, are individual BAAs considered to be local?
Mm.
And
Yeah,
kind
I
of
think,
following on what you were getting at, if we're experiencing issues in one BAA, is that just a local problem?
yeah, maybe I was using the word system level problem inappropriately, and I meant more of a BAA level problem. So system, to the BAA, right? Yeah.
I understand. I think where you were coming from, but wanted to raise that distinction. The other thing is, the thing that I keep coming back to is when you're in situations like that, trying to argue that we need to make sure the prices are accurate, and that I'm not sure that's true. We're in a situation in that point where the market is not functioning. The electric market is not like most other markets. In most other markets, the price would go up, and what you would see is load responding to those prices, and or not load, but the demand responding to those prices, and rationing out the amount of supply that's there. That doesn't happen in these markets. We that's not what you get when you do these, when load is curtailed. It's just, okay, we're going to take these people off, not because they're the ones, who have the, aren't willing to pay the high prices or any of that stuff. It's just, no, these are the ones we can take off, and the market is not functioning. The other thing that's going on at that point, when you're doing load shed like that, I don't know if what you're, at least for most of these issues that most of the time that we're talking about, I don't know that there's enough time that it's even going to bring in more load or do anything else, because basically the amount of supply that you have is based on the bids that were submitted, at least, like, what is it, at least 75 minutes before the hour. So if you suddenly declare load shed and raise the price, it's not like you're going to see a lot more load come on. You may, but it's probably 2 hours down, and by that point the load shed's probably done.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing that we need to consider with this when we're doing it. Are we doing this just because we like to think that the market is working? And I think we need to step back and understand what the electric market does, how it is different than some other markets, and maybe in those situations, are we actually going to, is it actually going to do something? So if we suddenly say, okay, we're going to pay people a ton more money, is that really going to bring on any more demand or any more supply? Is it going to actually affect anything, or is it just transferring money? And I do think that's something that needs to be considered.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not saying that, the prices should stay, down at $50 or whatever, but, I'm not sure that moving them up to, like 10,000 would do much, because I'm not sure, unless it's hitting that for a very long period of time, I'm not sure you're going to get any extra response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are fair comments. One thing I want to touch on, for the comments around the market during the emergency situation. So the market is designed to sort of power through load shedding conditions, especially in the real time market now where we have 20 plus BAs, where you still need to solve the WVIM for the rest of them. And so but there are, I confess that we maybe need to investigate periods where we had load shedding events within the WIM context in the past, and maybe this team, the PFE team, not KISO as a whole, because I'm sure the information is out there, but the PFA team needs to investigate more how market, sort of the expectations of the market in terms of its performance when there are load shedding events happening, and if there are things like market disruptions or suspensions or other things that I know are possibilities under the tariff, but like when we would rise to those levels. I think that seems like it would be some more helpful information.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And I know we have a bunch of hands. I have 3 more minutes allotted to this, but we should have more time for questions. So I think we'll have time for 1 more hand for this topic, and then I'll have to move on.
Okay, we have Alan, and then the next folks we will resume back to that list. Go ahead, Alan. Introduce yourself.
Hi, Alan Mack, PG&E. I had the same concern as Don and Alva, but let me try asking it more as an open-ended question. So if you have a load shedding event and you adjust the load forecast to add the missing load back in, it seems to me that would affect the dispatch in ways that are harmful, because that load's not there anymore, and the market will try to procure that power. How do you envision that would be solved?
Yeah, that's the core of it, right? Where we have these operational safeguards because, okay, let's break that down in a couple ways. First, you could have, you, insofar as there is surplus energy to be dispatched beyond the connected load, you could have operational issues in terms of managing ACE and frequency and other things, and that's something that we discussed in these proposals. And so that has to be managed. But on a second part of that, you also have the settlement implications insofar as that now you have metered load at a certain level, but dispatch supply at a completely different level. And now you have, real-time energy offsets that you need to pay or charge because you're needing to pay generators to dispatch at a certain level and only collecting some amount from load for what they're consuming, and that will mismatch. Now I guess I'll say, for lack of a better word, the good thing is that generally speaking, historically, the load shedding quantities have been fairly low. And so the impact of, these settlement and operational issues using history as a guide should also be fairly low and manageable. That's not guaranteed, of course, for the future. But, those are things that we'd have to think about. The only other thing I'll say is that the idea of trying to get as much dispatched in the market above and beyond connected load is an attempt to try to accelerate the transition back to full service, I guess. And so like you could maybe think about this as like we're trying to generate momentum for additional dispatcher commitment or interchange towards the shedding BAA for a brief period of time as it accelerates the switch back to full service for those folks, and that the issues operationally and settlements that are isolated to the load shedding event are hopefully can be contained in ways that make it worth it to either reduce the time that or severity of that load shedding event. So that's sort of the trade-offs we're working with.
But then you're making an assumption that the extra supply procured would be able to even reach the demand that was shed, because the market's going to, wherever it is that you put in the extra load. Well, I guess if you put in the extra load at the place where the load was actually shed, then maybe that solves that problem. But it seems like you're making an assumption, and seems thorny to me. And on top of that, you're over dispatching the market then, and then knowing that the load isn't actually there. I think you're not only increasing market prices, but you're also increasing real-time energy offsets at
Correct.
the same
It
time.
will.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
As an alternative, isn't this what the power balance constraint is supposed to nominally be for? It's a penalty price for violating not having enough energy, right?
Yeah, and the proposal talks about this, but the issue here is that the power balance constraint is violated. Well, if the power balance constraint is using the market input for demand that does not include the sort of latent demand, it only includes the connected load. And so like there may be enough supply and demand supply to meet the connected load, in which now your power balance constraint's not violated in the market. And so the whole idea is that you're trying to sort of have these load adjustments to trigger the power balance constraint to violate, because you're showing the market it's not just the connected load that's out there as demand, it's this extra load too. And so that getting you sort of the price that you're hoping for.
So what if you just say we're in a load shedding event, the power balance constraint will bind?
You could, so going, hold on, Danny. I'll let you. back in option or back in the straw proposal, we did have some options where you basically said you'd have it as simple as like if load shed event, then X price or X price. You couldn't do that. It wouldn't necessarily be exactly as you described, like if load shedding event, then power balance stream must bind. But you could implement rules where you say if load shedding event, then we set the price post hoc, not in the market, but after the market runs to some settlement price. So you could do something like that. Danny, go ahead. Danny, you there? Did I lose my audio?
I think your response was so insightful, it's silenced Danny. It's just
I see his audio bar signaling audio, but I don't hear anything.
okay. Well, that's okay. I was just thank you for helping me think through these things and
Yeah,
entertaining my.
yeah, I appreciate the feedback. Okay, so I know there's some hands in the queue. I have to move on. Okay, now I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Great.
Yeah.
Audio hiccup at headquarters. Alan's point on PBC is strong, and that's the key point. I think the way to look at this is in an advisory interval, the ISO is seeing that PBC is being violated and the surplus variable is taking a value, and not all load can be served. And so if that load's not served, what we're trying to do is not have that artificially suppress the price by clearing lower, because to your point earlier, that demand still exists. It's just with the inputs into the market algorithm, it's not being seen. And so we're just trying to kind of true that up and have a price that's reflective of the actual demand that would like to be served and isn't being foregone due to a lack of supply. Hope that helps, Alan.
Okay. Let's power forward, and I want the folks in the queue to stay in the queue if they can, because we will have time for more questions, but I do want to make sure that I have enough time to present the next proposal, and then we can come back to discussion. Let's see. Okay, I think there are 5 slides on this next proposal. Let's go to slide 18. Thanks for your patience, by the way, for folks that we didn't get to. So we're moving on now. So the previous slides were around pricing during load shedding. Now we're going to talk about something more specifically around pricing during armed load or load arming events, which are triggered by an EEA3 in the CAISO specifically. And we write up in the proposal that the process of arming load and how it impacts the market, and that RTD, the 5-minute market, can lose the scarcity signal that's present in the FMM because the RTD does not re-optimize ancillary services in the market. And so how this happens basically is that when load is armed, the RTPD or 15-minute process is procuring incremental ancillary services and comparing and doing that by comparing and valuing the using that capacity for incremental capacity for energy or for AS or ancillary services. And insofar as there's a shortage of the ancillary service requirement, the 15-minute market can price that shortage based on the existing scarcity reserve demand curve. And even if there's not a shortage, there is a feedback or a co-optimization where you now have the opportunity cost of these of using the same capacity for these two services that works their way into each other's prices. And so it's able to reflect the opportunity cost of using this limited capacity for either energy or ancillary services. But then when you get to RTD, or the 5-minute market process, RTD is solving to dispatch energy only and is not re-procuring or re-optimizing ancillary services. And so when RTD is going, when operators arm load and a subset of the capacity that was being used for contingency reserve is now released into the market for the market to do something else with. If the market were to take that capacity and now dispatch it for energy in RTD, there's no way for the market to reflect its opportunity cost of a reserve in RTD. And so that can lead to different, during arm load periods, can lead to different sort of pricing signals between RTPD and RTD that we're hoping to preserve in the RTD. Let's go to the next slide. So just a clarification here, this is something that I think confused folks when in the straw proposal, but we're talking about we're using the terms armed load and armed reserves and intending to use them differently, so we want to clarify them here. Armed load is firm load that's been designated by operators as available for immediate controlled disconnection. And basically this armed load, by being immediately available to be disconnected, can substitute for contingency reserves in the market and operationally. So what that means, when you arm load, you then, a subset of physical resources that were previously being held for contingency reserves can be released into the market for the market to do what it wants with it, including dispatch it for energy. And so when we talk about the term armed reserves, we're talking about that specific physical supply capacity that becomes now available to the market to be procured into energy or other products instead of being held for contingency reserves. And really the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish here is to reflect the opportunity cost of using this released armed reserve capacity when operators arm load in absence of RTD, fully co-optimizing energy and ancillary services, and thus not getting that sort of opportunity cost part of the price. We just want to be clear too that the process of arming load does not actually create new physical generation capacity. It's the same unit. It's just that a portion of the capacity that had once been fixed or held for contingency reserves is being replaced by armed load, and therefore can be used for other purposes. So it's just shuffling the way that the market is using the existing reserve capacity that's offered into the market at that time. Let's go to the next slide. So the proposal has much more technical information around with equations and other things about new constraints and variables and things of that nature, but I tried to make this concept as plain language and friendly as I could, just to illustrate the simple concept that we're trying to accomplish here. So we're thinking of this sequentially from left to right, where first we have a situation where operators are arming load. And as I had mentioned, that means that firm load's now becoming a substitute for physical capacity as a contingency reserve. And there's a portion of capacity that's once been held for contingency reserve that's now being released into the market for the market to do what it wants with it. And that covers boxes 1 and 2. So what we would do is we would create a new variable, an RTD, that essentially tracks how much of the armed reserve capacity is dispatched as energy. And when the RTD is using this capacity as dispatched for energy, there's a penalty value that's applied. And we are yeah, so there's a penalty of value that's applied, and we'll kind of walk through this logic in the example on the next slide that follows. So then, because of this, when RTD is dispatching this capacity, this armed reserve capacity for energy, the market price becomes not just the bid for the energy, but also the penalty cost that is representative of the opportunity cost of using that capacity as energy instead of holding it for reserves. So one thing to mention is that there was some feedback from the market monitor that in the straw proposal, we originally proposed a 3-tier curve structure, and the market monitor suggested that we consider only 1 tier to simplify the implementation, and we thought that that was a good and fair change. And so the revised straw proposal only uses 1 penalty value for any amount of reserve slack that's procured, and the actual penalty value will depend on what energy bid cap is prevailing based on FERC Order 831 conditions or not. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a pricing example. This comes directly from the proposal starting on page 7. The example in the proposal is going to be more detailed with more numbers, and I try to simplify it as much as possible for the presentation just to give you the feeling of what the proposal is doing. But we're starting out with a single resource here that we'll call resource A, and we imagine that it has a maximum output of 100 megawatts, and that it's currently outputting 50 megawatts, so half of its maximum, and has a spinning reserve award of 50 megawatts. So it has an energy award of 50 megawatts and a spinning reserve award of 50 megawatts in the real-time market. And then our load is armed, and the spinning reserve, this resource's spinning reserve award becomes released into the market, so the market can now use this 50 megawatts for other reasons, including for energy. So we have existing policy that says when we release these armed reserves into the market, that the energy bids associated with this capacity must be priced at the bid cap. So that's already existing policy that we have today. And so let's imagine that the prevailing bid cap at this time is $2,000 per megawatt hour. That means that the released energy bid for associated with this capacity is also going to be $2,000 as part of existing policy. And then on top of that, if the market wants to procure any of this capacity for energy in RTD, it's going to populate a reserve slack variable that has a penalty at the $2,000 cap of $700. And so when you combine those two, what would happen if RTD to the RTD price, if a megawatt of that release reserve is dispatched, would be the resource's bid price of $2,000 plus the reserve slack penalty of $700 for a total price of $2,700. Again, the purpose is to say that in absence of co-optimizing energy and ancillary services in RTD, that this opportunity or this $700 reflects the opportunity cost of no longer having this physical capacity being used for contingency reserves and converting it into energy, which the FMM would do, but the RTD does not do. And so it's trying to find a way to create consistency between the prices of energy between FMM and RTD when load farming load is active. Let's go to the next slide, please. The revised straw proposal does not extend this mechanism outside of the CAISO BA. The non-CAISO WIN participating BAs don't have the same framework for procuring ancillary services through the market. And so even if WMBAs had consistent load arming procedures as the CAISO BA, there would be no, functional benefit or pricing benefit for extending this to the WIMBAs at this time because of the way that they procure ancillary services. And so that could be something if in the long run, if ancillary services are extended to the WIM or EDAM entities broadly, that maybe could be considered in the long run. Also, that the straw proposal considered implementing sort of more bespoke mechanisms for WIM entities based on other types of emergency conditions that would mimic the effect of this pricing on the CAISO, and ultimately, based on the feedback, felt like doing that on BA by BA basis would be very complicated because all BAs will have different, emergency programs and other things that we'd have to adapt the policy to, would create inconsistencies in how this is applied across the market footprint. And ultimately, when we move to, if and when we move to a comprehensive scarcity pricing design, would become obsolete, or even an expanded AS framework for EIMBAAs would become obsolete. And so the proposal proposes to address these issues in forums where we're discussing more broader and integrated AS procurement and more comprehensive scarcity pricing. Okay, so that was a quick description of the proposal that you would find in detail in section 4.2.2. And we have, let's see, we have about 25 minutes for questions and feedback until I have to move on to the next set of slides.
The first person I have was Sibley. Let's go ahead and unmute Sibley.
Sibyl, your line is
There,
unmuted.
sorry, there we go. I was on the phone too, having trouble with this double mute. Thanks for the presentation today and putting together the proposal. I guess I wanted to weigh in a little on the prior discussion and just note that I hear a lot of valid perspectives about the current market's ability to have responsive load. I think we're designing here for a market that's evolving. And I think it's really important to think about the signals that we're setting in place, which hopefully the PGP view is incentivize more responsive demand so that we have further options for rather than it being this, whoever gets cut type of thing. There to actually be a response and response to these signals. And I think that's the whole point. And so while I think, again, there are a lot of valid points there about the current market's ability to, be responsive, our view is that part of the intent here is to reward supply that is responsive, whether that comes from the, physical supply side or from to develop and incentivize more responsive demand that can choose to participate in respond in these situations. So just wanted to make that point that there's the market is evolving. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that sometimes in these discussions we focus on the supply response more than, but scarcity pricing is intended to accurately reflect system conditions in ways that encourage all participants, consuming and producing, to change their behavior in ways that align towards a reliable outcome. And we don't want to lose this fact that, in fact, Susan Pope, the Western Energy Markets governing body market expert, has some interesting thoughts about that in her presentation that she's set to give. And so, and so far as that, and we kind of talked about this in November, that insofar as the opportunities for flexible demand to participate in the ISO markets are limited, that the scarcity pricing can become an opportunity perhaps for more participation, more incentive for flexible demand. Because ultimately, like we talked about this in November, that scarcity pricing and these administrative values for certain levels of load and all that comes because the market operator has to ration the limited available supply given the level of demand, insofar that consumers are not able, well, consumers broadly, I'm talking broadly here, are not able to represent their willingness to consume to the market. And so ideally you would, in a perfect world where you have perfect flexibility of both supply and demand, then you have consumers who are the ones who are deciding which specific consumers don't have the willingness to pay for energy at specific levels, and the market equilibrium becomes something that the market operator doesn't have to intervene in with load shedding and other things, because everyone decides for themselves how much is consumed and when and at what price. So that, again, that's like a long-term view of it, but I think my point is, I think we agree with you, Sybil, that that's not something that we should lose in this discussion.
Well said. Thank you.
Next, we have Alva.
Hello again, James. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. Alva PG&E. I have a question on this portion, but I wanted to basically weigh in favor of this proposal and just express my feeling that a lot of the comments have been made are really just about keeping the scope limited of what's being done here. Because if we're limiting this to particular kinds of actions that are taken by operators under certain conditions, then I think the concerns that Steve and Bonnie expressed are not really going to be active in this setting. So I think that this is a solution that avoids a sort of what Danny was alluding to. There's perverse outcomes that can happen and have happened due to the way the market currently treats load shedding. And I think that in particular, this could become even more exaggerated as the amount of battery load that we have in the system has increased to the point where batteries that are bid into the market may get charging instructions under these kinds of conditions. You essentially have responsive load now as battery bids. So I think there needs to be this kind of treatment of periods of load shedding. Essentially, I agree with what Alan was saying, that you're looking to trigger the load balance constraint, but what I don't think he realizes, you have to have load in the dispatch model in order to trigger the load balance constraint. You can't just sort of declare it triggered. So I think maybe the way to compromise on that, or to get that to happen anyway, is and this goes back to my question about what's the correct quantity to use under these circumstances, maybe just to insert enough load essentially to trigger the load balance constraint into the dispatch for some period until until perhaps telemetry indicates that either it's above or below by a sufficient amount that you don't do that anymore, or as you were pointing out, you have a better description of how you end these periods. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think that you can sort of take that lesson from what Alan was saying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my basic comment. Is I think that within a limited scope, I think your approach to load shedding really is doing the right thing. On this second area of armed load, I was wondering, am I correct? In your example, I think one thing we've seen in the past when reserves were armed was situations where you don't see essentially no price signal at all, because those reserves aren't necessarily dispatched, right? They're just in the stack. Am I correct that
Correct.
under these circumstances, you would at least see the $700 in the RTD price, and therefore you're going to see an actual response in the market to the arming of reserves that is going to be significant?
The answer is maybe, because when the RTD is running, presumably if there is we'll call it regular energy,
Right.
energy
Non-contingency.
offered energy offered from capacity that was not previously held as reserves, those are going to be priced at, using the regular bid price. And so the market's going to use up as much of that as possible, obviously, because it'll be cheaper. And then when it gets to the armed reserve capacity, because it has this penalty value associated with it, then that's when you start to have the prices rise, which in a way I'll say, relative to your framing, is a good and a bad thing. It's a bad thing in the sense that it doesn't automatically apply, as your framing suggests, but it also orders it in sort of an intuitive way, insofar as that when you're dispatching the armed reserve capacity, it is the last resort capacity at that point. It's the most expensive for the market to use. Therefore, it organizes the price response in a way that signals, okay, when we're starting to use this armed reserve capacity for energy, we know we're really in it and getting close, right? And so in a way, it does provide, in my view, an intuitive ordering hierarchy of the pricing outcome. What do you think?
Okay. Well, I think, and I'm not being careful about this because I didn't read the proposal, unfortunately. And I'm not sure I would have had anything to say about it, but I kind of think there should be a penalty in the real-time market just by virtue of the fact that reserves have been armed. So I was liking more the idea that the penalty was added to whatever the energy price was, but you're right, that doesn't work. I guess I have to think about it a little bit more, but it seems like essentially it's very likely that the effect of this is going to be very minor, because as I said, most of the time when we've seen reserves armed, and I'm speaking anecdotally, so I may not be right, but my impression was that very often there was no visibility in the market at all of this happening. And this is going to be limited visibility, and it's not going to happen very often because those resources are at $2,000, so they're going to be at the very top of the bid stack in any case. So frequently, there's not going to be any visibility of this happening, and that would be my concern in the RTD. So, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Torsten.
Hello, Torsten Keeper with Flynn Resource Consultants on behalf of BAMX. Thanks for this presentation, James. I think this makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a worthy goal to make sure that prices rise more gradually before scarcity events occur, so that we're getting the resources online and we don't have crazy price spikes. I do wonder a little bit about some of the details of the proposal, starting with the $700 compensation for the opportunity cost that you showed on your example slide. I'm curious if that doesn't somehow represent double compensation for those resources, because are we not already paying capacity payments or resource adequacy payments to those resources to be available? And from like a fundamentals perspective, I understand that there's some kind of fundamental conflict between resource adequacy type incentive programs and scarcity pricing type incentive programs. So I would hope that we don't compensate those resources twice.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I'll try to back my way into how we came up with those values, and we can reassess your question. So in the FMM, we have as the slides mentioned, we have energy and AS co-optimization, and in the FMM, insofar as we have the market cannot solve for the quantity of AS that's required by the market inputs, then we have the scarcity reserve demand curve that takes a value when the AS requirements can't be met. And those have established values in the tariff on a tiered schedule that we've shown in the past. The moving into the RTD, because RTD does not have energy and AS co-optimization, the scarcity reserve demand curve has no impact on RTD prices. However, what this proposal is sort of getting at is that absent this sort of energy and AS co-optimization in RTD, there still is sort of inherent opportunity cost of using this capacity that was once being held as a reserve for energy. Because if you had done the same exact thing in FMM, you would have violated the scarcity reserve demand curve, and this additional cost would have shown up in FMM. And so it's almost a way of mimicking what already happens in FMM, but doing it in RTD, recognizing that the construct of those actual markets are different in the sense that one is solving for AS and one is not. And so the actual values, in this case 700, when the energy bid cap is $1,000, it would be half that price of 350. Come from the middle tier, basically, of the existing scarcity reserve demand curve cap, or demand curve values that exist in the FMM, and just putting them into RTD.
Okay, that makes sense. And so then does it follow that if we've gone past the point of deploying the reserves and we need to shed load, that then load should also be compensated according to their contribution as the marginal resource?
Meaning that, are you implying that
right?
Are you implying that you would then compensate the, okay, let's say that you disconnect, let's just say, for example, you disconnect 500 megawatts of load from the system, and that as part of the firm load shed, and then to compensate the 500 megawatts of shed load at the scarcity price, basically?
Yeah, effectively, because I think in that situation, the load is the marginal resource, right? And so if we're really trying to incentivize demand side participation, and correct this other assumption if it's wrong, but my assumption is that supply side participation, well, let me clarify. I know that we treat load shedding or demand response type resources and generation type resources as, almost perfect substitutes, but here I think they're not, at least from a compensation standpoint. So assuming that all generation type supply is exhausted and the marginal resources then, load, shouldn't load receive compensation for their contribution to system stability?
I haven't thought about this. I haven't thought about that idea in detail, so I'm going to hesitate to provide any sort of formal response, and I'll be curious if others want to weigh in on that. But it's an interesting thought. I'm not sure I have a good prepared response for you, though.
Anyway, that seems like that would be a good way to get load to participate.
Yeah, I'd like to keep thinking about that. Yeah.
And then, sorry, the last question that I have is just in the context of this broader change to Western energy market pricing caps. These examples seem to be, kind of couched in the old world where the $2,000 soft offer cap was a thing. Are there any concerns that continuing to use price caps inside the ISO could lead to resources simply being unavailable if there are higher prices outside of CAISO?
So that is a good question. And you're referring to a recent FERC decision to lift the WEC soft offer cap. In fact, I don't think there's any offer cap currently for WEC. This, of course, doesn't apply inside the ISO administered market. So these are caps for bilateral sales and things like that. So we still have, FERC ordered bid caps, supply bid caps. And the basic question being, are there, is the CAISO thinking about potential inconsistencies that can arise, by the lack of these caps? Is that the fundamental question?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of like a power uh, opportunity cost question, that if a generator exists outside of the CAISO and would, under the prior world, have exported
Mm-hmm.
into the ISO, but maybe now is getting a better price somewhere else. I worry about the disconnect and the potential supply issues that might create.
Yeah, I will say as not a part of this and not a part of this individual proposal is that considered, but the ISO is thinking about those things broadly and how it affects scarcity pricing. There was a little bit of discussion about that, I think, in the January 2026 MSC meeting, where there's sort of broader questions about, call it CAISO, or I'm sorry, CAISO market, so like WEIM competitiveness within the market in terms of what prices it can offer suppliers for offering in and being dispatched to serve load in the market footprint relative to both non-market participants, selling bilaterally, and other Western market opportunities. And so I think broadly speaking, in the long run, it is definitely something the ISO needs to be, focusing its attention on in terms of, if its markets still are offering sort of a sufficient competition to get supply when needed from, the Western interconnect directed into the market footprint.
That makes sense. And thanks for responding to my rapid fire question here. I accidentally put my hand down halfway through the conversation, so I saved a few up. Thanks again, James.
Yeah, thank you. I've got,
Yeah.
Brenda, I've got
Go ahead.
about 5 minutes to close the questioning for this section, but then we should definitely have time at the end, because my next section I think only has about 2 or 3 slides, so we may need to hold some people.
Okay. Of the list up here, hopefully the question next will be like regarding this one, but we can always come back. So Dawn, if you can go briefly share any comments, we will go ahead.
Sure. Don Trethewey, California Energy Storage Alliance. I'll respond to the previous caller. If a load serving entity had fully scheduled their load day ahead and then was instructed to load shed in real time, they would be paid the $2,700 for that deviation, because their meter would be less than their day ahead cleared load forecast.
Right.
With regards to just applying this to CAISO, I am concerned with that approach. I think and this is another reason why CISA in prior comments has highlighted that you actually don't need AS reoptimization to one, implement a comprehensive scarcity pricing, but even for implementing what we're talking about here, which is just ways to make sure that the price doesn't crater because of actions with regards to AS armed load and shedding load and all that. So in this narrow scope. But my concern would be that if CAISO has this, well, there's a rule that says an EIM balancing authority area can't violate its power balance constraint to serve somebody else's load in the footprint. If there were 2 balancing authority areas that were arming load, one was the CAISO and one was somebody else in the EIM, then CAISO would have a higher price for serving its load than the other balancing authority area in the WEAM. And I don't think that's necessarily the outcome that we would want. And so, again, I think this is where, we do have individual power balance constraints for every single balancing authority area in the WEAM. We're not looking to find ways to trigger that power balance constraint to bind, but we need to find some way to relax some requirement so that we can keep the prices where we want them. In these, in essence, we're not approaching scarcity; we are in scarcity. So I would really reconsider. You know, we need to stop thinking about the market as individual balancing authority areas. We still have to work around that, but you know, the market is optimizing over a single footprint, and we should, to the extent that we can have the same impact across the entire EDAM footprint and EIM footprint, we should strive for that.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
Thanks.
That's good feedback. Let's go ahead and do, I'll have time for one more question and then I'll move on, Brenda. And then I encourage the folks that are in the queue to keep their hands raised and we'll take them at the end.
Okay. The next question we have is Kathleen. Go ahead. Oh, let me get you 1 second. Kathleen, you should be unmuted.
Great,
Go ahead.
thanks. Yep, thank you, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I'll be brief because I just want to make sure that we're all understanding the proposal. So, quick clarifying question, very directly, James, to clarify that this proposal only changes the price at which the armed load is released. It does not guarantee that the energy price is set to that price.
That's correct.
Perfect. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that crispness kind of got lost in some of the comments. I appreciate that. The other very crisp clarification I think would be useful is the way that I receive your proposal is it's trying to kind of be an interim towards moving to a policy where CAISO acknowledges it's appropriate for ancillary service reserve shortage pricing to be reflected in the energy price when it clears. Is that a fair understanding of kind of the high level policy that I think you're trying to put forward here?
Yeah, I think it's a convergence of two different issues there. One is that we do hold that all or sort of principle in the FMM because that market actually does AS and energy co-optimization and RTD doesn't. So it's part of it is like, you know, in absence of full AS co-optimization and RTD, this is a step that we could take to have the prices during severe conditions be, you know, not be lost between FMM and RTD. And so I kind of think of it that way. But that also, though, we can have discussions and we plan discussions in the longer run about, you know, AS, full AS reoptimization in the real-time market, what that might mean for FMM and RTD going forward. And so I'm not, at least in this proposal, not presupposing that our intention is to, you know, completely mimic the FMM AS trade-off, just in this specific condition. Yeah.
Trying to keep it super tight. I actually wasn't even thinking about co-optimization, so put that outside your head.
Okay.
I'll clarify one thing that you said that I just have a nuanced view on. I still see the same issue in the 15-minute market, even with co-optimization, where the energy clearing price does not always reflect the ancillary service shortage prices. And it's really driven by the fact that we put a higher priority on ancillary services compared to energy. Other markets that kind of flip that priority order and also have reserve price adders, you do see it in the clearing price. So for our market, and I'm sure you agree with that, like there's absolute, unless opportunity cost is surfaced because we do not meet reserve with that resource, we allow it to meet the energy need, it does not show up even under co-optimization due to that priority. So for me, that's actually been my focus. Not so I don't want to talk about co-optimization. Like even under co-optimization, because of the priorities, it doesn't always surface. We want to address that issue. Vistra wants to address that issue. I have taken this proposal as CAISO trying to move the ball forward for parties that have that viewpoint to say armed load is a subset of not meeting reserves that you think is appropriate that energy clearing price should reflect. And I just, that policy statement, if it's crisper, I think helps with this understanding. Thanks, Shane.
Yeah, I think the way you put it is fair. I wouldn't change a thing. Okay. Let's go ahead and I encourage folks that are in the queue to hold in the queue, and we'll get to you. And I'm going to present the last couple of slides, and then we'll close out for some questions and wrap up with feedback. Let's go to slide 24. Sorry, slide 23. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about briefly about these two deferred issues. One of them being sort of administrative pricing for emergency actions. This was something that had some space in the original Stroud proposal that did not materialize into anything specific in the revised Stroud proposal. With the sort of main issue being that a general observation that out-of-market actions can change prices by either adding supply or reducing demand outside of the market optimization. And so, of course, out-of-market actions are, we support actions that are needed to be taken to protect reliability. But, a goal of market design is to try to get, the responses that make operators feel like the grid is being utilized in its most reliable state possible, all directed through market outcomes. And so, over the long run, out-of-market actions becoming less and less necessary. The issue in specific to this proposal was that, we sort of floated the idea of like, okay, you could have pricing, sort of a scarcity, we'll call it scarcity pricing or administrative pricing present that triggers based on discrete emergency levels or other actions that are taken. And that the major problem obviously is that every BA is different, has different emergency programs, different tolerances for different types of conditions and things like that. And so again, the ISO doesn't think, based on the stakeholder record to date, that it would be a worthwhile investment to try to design sort of bespoke rules for each BA based on their own actions and conditions, and are much more interested in developing in the working group a longer term path towards some sort of future, latent reserve ORDC or energy supply margin approach that using actual interval by interval market conditions as the basis for providing the reliability value at certain times, so that as I think as Don was putting it, provide sort of this consistent framework for every BA in the market to have a valuation of how close they are to the edge, essentially, and for the market to direct supply in that direction. And so with that said, though, we also recognize that the proposal does have does propose specific pricing mechanisms that are present during firm load shedding, because firm load shedding and the EA3 process is something that's more or less consistently triggered, or at least maybe not the application of load shedding, but at least the declaration of the emergency level and the declaration of load shedding is something that is, very comparable across balancing areas. And so, and also a severe condition. And so we take exception to that particular emergency as not applying to this slide. But we're talking about some of the other issues that were brought up. And so, our view at this time is that it would be better to, instead of having pricing based on, specific actions going on in the market or by certain operators, then it'd be better to have it as all endogenous within the market based on the amount of latent supply available for each balancing area. Let's go to the next slide, please. I don't feel like I need to spend a bunch of time on this issue, but of course the revised Stroud proposal defers the design of comprehensive scarcity pricing And we've heard over the last several months varying perspectives on both how quickly the ISO should undertake the development of this design, but also the scope. And so just to reiterate that the revised draft proposal advances what we'll call targeted changes that we think in the interim on our way to developing more comprehensive changes for scarcity pricing we think could be beneficial. And to reiterate that we are planning to resume working group discussions on this issue after governance decision for these changes, also connected with the CAISO's treatment within the BA grouping approach that we discussed yesterday. And then let's go to slide 25, and then we'll pause for questions. So obviously here we are, July 13th and 14th meetings on these revised draft proposal. We'll have formal written comments due on July 28th, which I believe is a Tuesday. We do plan to, as a next step, to issue a draft final proposal based on that feedback sometime in September, with the goal of seeking governance approval for the items within this proposal in October, which then applies a step that's not listed on the slide of resuming the working group discussions on the longer term deferred items in sometime at the end of the year. Okay, so I've got about 16 minutes for some concluding questions and feedback, and then we can wrap the meeting up.
We first have Michelle Keto. Your line's unmuted.
Hey, James, it's Michelle Keto. Hey, I was wondering if you could help me clarify some order of operations, especially with regard to armed load, but also the dropping load. So let's say post-HASP, something occurs like during the bootleg fire where we lost the incoming transmission line. We continued to support low priority exports, and indeed we armed load. Are you proposing to arm load before cutting low priority exports, either pre or actually post-HASP?
The proposal or the changes in this proposal would not impact the timing of the arm load, only the outcome of it.
So are you saying that you would actually arm load and go to scarcity pricing before cutting the low priority exports post-HASP? I really need clarification.
It would be subject to the current operational procedures that are present today, and I'm not sure if the way you're framing it is the right way to put it. I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm not sure. All I'm saying is that
what would we have done in the bootleg fire where we lost the incoming transmission line? We armed load because we were supporting low priority exports. Are you saying we would go into scarcity pricing for that circumstance?
I'm saying, yeah, under the changes in this proposal, again, the decision, the timing of the arming load would continue with whatever operationally that's done today, and all the changes in this proposal would reflect what would happen in the market after that decision.
I feel like there's something in your tariff that says that you cut low priority exports either close to or before an EEA2 and certainly before an EEA3. So I really think it's important that we specify what we're doing here, because I don't think folks would be okay sending CAISO into scarcity because we're supporting low priority exports.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not intending to take up yeah. I mean, this proposal is not intending to take up that issue, but it could be.
But it's critical, right? Because this has happened before. And so we need clarity about what you intend to do, what CAISO intends to do. Like if you say, no, I'm going to cut the low priority exports before I arm load, then I'll be like, okay. But if you say I'm going to arm load, send us into scarcity and not cut the low priority exports, I think that's problematic.
Michelle, this is Danny with the ISO, and we have been clear on this before. We intend to give our system operators discretion and not tie their hands in emergency situations about following an order of operations. They know they have the ability to curtail LPT exports. They know they have the ability to arm firm load. neither of those decisions is taken lightly, and we would, as James mentioned, not propose to change their existing authority to undertake those decisions.
Yeah, but you are changing the price that would come out of something that we don't know because it's up to operator discretion, and that seems problematic.
I don't have any issues with letting the CAISO VA system operators use their discretion to respond to emergency conditions as they see fit.
Well, okay, so let's say we have the bootleg fire. So you're saying that we're going to send us into scarcity pricing to support the low priority exports post HASP. I mean, I just want to be clear. That's what you're saying. And likewise,
No,
you're saying the
what
same
I'm
thing
saying
for...
is that is a real-time decision that'll be made by the system operators. Obviously, to the extent that they can make curtailments, they would. It's not always a straightforward situation. You may cut an export, and that may have been providing counterflow to support an import, so you may have achieved nothing. Like, these are all items that are system operators are considering kind of during real-time and emergencies, and we intend to retain that ability for them to make these types of decisions.
Well, then I don't support this, because I think we have really made clear the order of operations that we want to occur. And I thought we had that in the tariff. And now you're saying that we can hit scarcity by arming load to support low priority exports, and that we are not in scarcity conditions. So I think it's problematic. And I think we need to have very, very clear certainty on what the order of operations is, or just no, don't do this yet, and since we don't have clarity. And HASP is not supposed to be binding, right? But you're making it binding.
HASP fixes the hourly intertie schedules, and they can be curtailed or adjusted after HASP, but HASP serves as a baseline for what those schedules are. So HASP wouldn't clear those schedules and would curtail them automatically if a scarcity condition was present. To the extent something materializes after HASP, that becomes an operator discretion type decision about how emergencies are managed.
Yeah, and we have examples of the bootleg fire where we armed load to support low priority exports, and under your proposal, this would require us to go into scarcity. I mean, we have an actual example of it, right? Okay.
The operators made a decision to arm load in that instance, and to the extent there were low priority exports that were not curtailed, that was an operating decision, and it was made for their discretion and to support reliability. So I'm not going to go back and Monday morning order back their decisions during emergency conditions, nor do we intend to create a checklist that limits their ability to respond to emergencies.
Okay,
we're simply trying to send a stronger price signal when the market needs more supply.
Okay, so if you arm load in the situation of the bootleg fire, and we go and we put it in at $2,700, but then in HASP, in the next HASP that can see that we don't have the transmission line and we cut low priority exports, there would be no scarcity pricing. Am I correct in that, or am I not?
So the $2,700 price in the example would show up in RTD if the RTD is using the armed reserve capacity and dispatching it for energy, and then eventually the feedback loop from future HASP solves and the intertie conditions would find its way into RTD, depending on if RTD, if there's still load arming going on after the new HASP run. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of depend. So the outcome depends on a lot of different things.
So we could cut the low priority exports and not need the armed load, but the armed load could still be in effect. And you're saying that that would go into the market, and so we'd still have $2,700.
So there would be this feedback loop where if the RTD was dispatching these armed reserves for energy, then of course RTD, the binding condition of the RTD run becomes what we call the terminal condition for FMM and HASP. So meaning like the FMM and HASP runs are taking information from previous RTD runs to know like what the current set point of all these schedules are. And so if so the FMM and HASP is going to see that, you know, RTD has dispatched certain units for energy and is still going to try to solve, you know, its particular problem by, you know, optimizing the FMM and HASP as it sees fits. But we'll see that RTD is, you know, used up some of that for energy. It's possible that FMM also, like, there's nothing that prevents the FMM or HAPS from re-procuring that capacity back as AS too, or for other reasons. So it doesn't like stick with energy just because the RTD dispatched it. It's sort of all reevaluated in the market in
So
FMM and
this is
HAPS.
why I think we have to deal with the HASP issue before we move to the scarcity pricing for HASP. So I think this has been our concern all along, is that we are supposed to be able to cut low priority exports before going into these emergency conditions, but you guys aren't promising that we'll do that. And so that seems problematic to me. So thank you.
Michelle, if you can detail in your comments the concern, that would be helpful, because we think with
But
the
do
way
you not
that the
understand it,
HASP is
Danny?
set up, and that well, if the HASP looking forward 7 15-minute intervals sees a problem, it wouldn't clear, it would curtail the LPT exports. So what we're narrowly talking about is not really a HASP issue. It's a, you didn't see a problem when you were clearing HASP, and then something intervening occurs between then and the RTD interval or real-time ops.
Right. Which is,
and I agree that there's a there, like that is a real-time operating emergency.
What's happened.
And
It was the one time we armed load, right? Not the only, but the most,
yeah,
I mean.
It was
Okay.
one of the times the CAISO BA has taken the action of arming load.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I feel like there are others, but maybe they just sort of go underneath the radar. So, okay, thanks. I think we armed reserves recently. Maybe you guys could highlight that issue as well. Thanks.
Next, we have Torsten. And if everyone could be brief, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I will be brief. I just sort of wanted to say that the concern about the lack of a WEC bait or a WEC-wide price cap, I think, also plays into concerns about low priority exports to a certain extent. And as far as the load shedding compensation topic goes, my concern is that we make sure that the individuals who are actually responsible for having their load curtailed, i.e. end-use customers, are receiving some sort of compensation for their participation, whether it is voluntary or involuntary, because they are the marginal resource. It's not sufficient for that to simply be delivered to the LSE unless we don't really care if we're incentivizing those individual customers to participate at certain price levels. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's something that we can put some more thought into for the next proposal. Thanks for bringing that up.
And then lastly, we got Dan Williams.
Hey, thanks, James. Great meeting, and I'll try and make this super brief because we're out of time here. But just I can't help but note that the sort of the cure to, I think, what Michelle was concerned about is having the graduated scarcity pricing come into the market sooner than the when you're getting to that point of shedding load. You know, the earlier it comes in, the more it sends a price signal to low priority exports that you don't want to be exporting because we're headed into high price conditions. And of course, on the other side of that, you have to deal with the price cap issue. And that was what I wanted to comment on, was just in the future or at some point, it would be great for CAISO to kind of lay out what you see as falling into a like market seams issue bucket versus a price formation or scarcity pricing bucket that we're working on this initiative. And so I look at, like, with the changes that are happening, especially by 2028, of existing CAISO interties turning into EDAM interties, severe changes to CAISO's intertie market, and the ability for CAISO to use the intertide market as sort of the a substantial form of price discovery also brings in getting less and less connection to index-based trading in the West and the day-ahead market that we use to set the maximum import bid price, that we use around that Order 831 policy, that there's just all these kind of fundamentals changing that impact price formation, that impact scarcity pricing. But I'm guessing CAISO would say those are more like issues we have to deal with in a seams context, not bring into this and wait until we have a comprehensive scarcity pricing solution to, sort of acknowledge that those changes are happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think you're likely to hear discussion of that in both contexts, probably within, sort of themes related context, and maybe less so, but somewhat also here in the price formation context. Because again, we're going to be resuming these discussions. And actually, I wanted to highlight that the comment template that we'll be providing or have already provided from these meetings will inquire or ask stakeholders to provide comments on the future priorities and other things as we move into the next phase of this initiative. And we've already talked about some things that we want to talk about and solve relating to scarcity pricing and mitigation. But use that as an opportunity to put some things on everybody's radar to highlight if there are some specific discussions that we need to have around concerns around the inconsistency of the lack of a WEX soft offer cap and sort of CAISO footprint market pricing and things like that. We just sort of love to hear what's important to folks. So that hopefully is a good opportunity to let that be heard.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. And I think of it as like, even if it's not the primary scope item in this initiative, it's at least something that we can talk about and have in mind when thinking about the primary scope item in this initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So again, really good meeting. Looking forward to the upcoming ones, and thanks for the time today.
Thank you. Brenda, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Danny. Appreciate your help and feedback on all these topics. So as we mentioned earlier, we do have the July 28th deadline for the comments for both day 1, day 2, CA level market mitigation, and then scarcity pricing. I also want to quickly kind of give an overview of the comment template that we have updated for this specific meeting. And it does highlight a different structure than what we normally have posted. So you will be utilizing the voting to kind of provide a little bit more extra understanding of where your position lays for your organization. So it will be the first question, just summarize the organization's overall position for the registrar proposal. The second one, you could just leave it blank. It's just basically explaining if you can provide the position that you will be providing for that specific topic. So you'll see that on your comment template when you are answering those. At this time, the last few updates I can provide to everyone here is that we do have our stakeholder symposium scheduled at the end of October 5th, and that will include a welcome reception on the Kempton Sawyer, as well, and also October 6th for the State Credit Union Convention Center for the main program. Sponsorship opportunities are still available, so if you would like to do that, please do that so soon. We do have a great hard deadline for printing, so coming up early September. So if you do plan to sign up for sponsorship package, please let us know. That way we can include your logo. And then lastly, on just the energy blog matters, we did post recently one of the episodes featuring Market Surveillance Committee, Dr. Ben Hobbs and Scott Harvey. And then a few episodes will be coming later on this month. But other than that, we will keep everyone posted with notices in terms of the price formation enhancements initiative. And we look forward to hearing your comments before July 28th. Thanks so much, and I'll pass it to Chris, my event producer. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.